Okay, good afternoon. This is John Bushka again, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the issue of gratuitous content, the kind of content that I publish, and whether it should pay its own way or whether it's gratuitous and I should be held more accountable for it than I have been. That's an issue that came up in 2018 when I published a video that I filmed at a friend's house called The Dangerous Thought Experiment, in which I suggested that because of future changes that I thought would happen, the gutting of Section 230, we were passing a new bill about FOSTA at the same time, and there had been some sites closed down after Charlottesville and a lot of other things that were happening. I feared that at some point in the future, individuals would only be able to have branding sites, that is, sites, major websites in their own name, or major, YouTube channels or blog channels. I wasn't talking about social media sites that are more ephemeral, whether Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, or even Snapchat or something. I wasn't talking about sites that are not really perceived that way in the same way, although Twitter kind of is now. This was published in April of 2018, and then, as you may recall, that during the year, you started seeing a lot more censorship. In the fall, the Facebook purges, and then you started seeing Sargon of Akkad purged by Patreon at the end of 2018, and then a lot of people, mainly on the left, were being censored and so forth. A couple of years into the Trump administration. Let me just go back to the first printing of my book, in 1997. That actually did sell, and at the beginning this was about books. It actually was about printed books. Since 1990, I had worked for a company that sold life insurance to members of the military. And the building that was in Boston, and eventually commerce moved on, and it was eventually torn down about 15 years ago, and we have brand new office buildings there in Boston and so forth. But I just thought I would pass that on as an anecdote. But anyway, I actually had a printing of close to 400 books, and that pretty much sold out in 3 years. And then I went to print on demand after that. And in print on demand, my books have not sold particularly well in terms as consumer items. And it's partly that they're written in kind of a distant style, kind of an academic style. They're not written in order to please a lot of customers the way a lot of their other books are that are more in the tone of conventional activism. The second book was written at the end of 2002. That was a year after 9/11, and the third book was written in 2014. But when I was working for this company, Uslyco, it got bought in 1995 by Northwestern National Life, and because the company had it mainly catered to members of the military as one of its primary customer bases. And because I had decided to write a book about gays in the military, I was concerned about the idea of a conflict of interest, that if I was depending on this as my source of income, that there was an ethical problem. And I did talk to him about it. And in general, the feeling was it probably wasn't, because you didn't have any ability to underwrite customers. You would have a similar situation if I was a teacher, for example, and I had a chance to grade them and determine their futures, but you weren't making decisions that affected customers. But anyway, we all thought it was best that I moved to go to the headquarters company anyway, and I moved to Minneapolis and the start of September of 1997 and lived there 6 years, and that was one of the biggest reasons, was this perceived conflict. That's how it was then, the idea, there was an example of how the military ban could spill over into civilian life indirectly. Well, as time went by, what happened was I instead emphasized my websites, and I did make the books available online, sort of an honor system, um, but I had a site I had a publishing company that was called High Productivity Publishing, and I had a number of versions of this website, which actually was pretty sophisticated, even though it was just HTML. And I had different categories of information and I even had ads, and I also had 7 a.m. news and had some stuff. In 2005, I combined everything onto the other site called doaskdotell.com, and there were various forms of it over time. And in the beginning of 2006, I started using Blogger, and there were 16 blogs, and they were indexed from the homepage of Do Ask Do Tell. And some of the biggest one was just named after me, Bill Bushka at the time. And then then there were blogs on movie reviews, book reviews, music and plays, and then internet safety, gay and lesbian issues, just major political issues, information technology jobs, a bunch of other things. That was more how it looked more recently. And I became increasingly concerned, as I said, around 2008. And and I decided that I would take most of the material down at the end of 2021, which I did. The Blogger blogs came down after 16 years on January 3rd of 2022, I'm sorry, the end of 2021 was January of 2022. And then later in 2022, the 4 WordPress blogs came down, and then finally all the old Do Ask Do Tell content came down earlier this year. It was a little more complicated, and it's replaced by simply a commercial site with links to commercial sites that sell the books. So I only have one site where I express my opinions. It's either this site in my name, this flat site in my name with archives of the old files, or it's a blog that's actually hosted by WordPress. I had some security problems hosting it with the other provider so it's this blog in my name, which is actually hosted by WordPress. So that's it for putting stuff online right now. But going through the history of it, back in the middle 2000s, I had come home after the layoff at the end of 2001, post 9/11, and living with my mother until she passed away at the end of 2010. There were concerns that just the visibility I was attracting to some controversial issues, which started with gays in the military, but then kind of migrated to some other things, free speech itself, the Child Online Protection Act, and some of these other things. That if I wasn't actually getting paid for it and was doing it just out of vanity, that could attract security problems for my mother, or for even insuring the home or something. It never happened, but I was concerned about it. My mother passed away in the end of 2010, and I got the house as an inheritance. And for a number of years, I kept those blogs going pretty much the way they were. Things started to change in 2016 after Trump was a strong candidate. I was concerned, there had always been a concern over whether Blogger, because they had a tendency to remove blogs that they thought were spam blogs, sometimes without very good reason. So I'd always been a little bit concerned about the stability, but they didn't seem to have any issues with me, even though I had 6. But I decided in 2016 to add 2 more. I had added 2 WordPress blogs that were more about my circumstances in 2014, I added 2 more of them in 2016. And then, of course, a lot of surprises happened. I got involved a little bit in the issue of whether I should host an asylum seeker. That didn't really happen, but that would have made me a little bit more credible as having some other responsibilities for people if I had. That kind of fell through. But by 2018, as I said, we were very concerned about FOSTA, very concerned about eventually the demise of Section 230. And so I had to consider and I was although my money is segregated into what belongs to the beneficiaries and what belongs to me, and it's strict, there are strict things about that. I don't feel like I can ask people for money. I don't feel like I could join Patreon or anything. So there are real problems. Now, what does it mean for a site to be commercial? And by the way, YouTube raised that issue at the end of 2019 in conjunction with COPPA, which they had a provision in their terms of service where they said they could require sites to be commercially viable. It kind of died, but that's something they said at the end of 2019. What does it mean to be it could mean that you're selling something normally. You're selling a product, or you're selling something like life insurance, or you actually have a profession. You're a lawyer or something, and this is just your site, but it's your other profession is the product, not the site itself. Or it could mean that as I began to realize by 2018, I hadn't really noticed this before, how many people were making a living off of YouTube, which I wasn't, by getting sponsors and by either running ads from YouTube, or particularly by doing their own ads, vocalizing their own ads for sponsors as part of their presentations. I hadn't really noticed that until about 2018. There had, as far back as 2006, I had used AdSense on Blogger. And in 2008 and 2009, particularly about the time of the financial crisis, and that's kind of ironic, I was actually getting some income from Blogger that was helpful, but not enough to pay everything, but it was helpful. And then that kind of died off. There were a few spectacular blogs like Heather Armstrong's Mommy Blog and everything that did real well. And there was a site called Blog Tyrant by a guy in Australia, which tried to show you how to make money from blogging. And he had a lot of different suggestions, but he said you had to be very aggressive getting customers with email lists and so forth. Well, that kind of suggests something objectionable. That kind of suggests spams, something that's kind of maybe you wouldn't want, a lot of people wouldn't want to do. He also suggests niche blogging. Well, I wasn't really, I was talking about political issues all over the cross, and blogging gave you the ability to cover a lot of issues that circled around my original concern, which was don't ask, don't tell, and then all the things that it could imply for civilian life. Blogging gave me the ability to do that, and it was much faster to put things up on blogs than it was on videos. So in a sense, I got a lot of attention, particularly with respect to certain topics like trademark issues. There were a couple of restaurants in West Virginia that changed their names because they were concerned that they could be confused with some names in Virginia after I blogged about it, the issue. And there were, another one was filial responsibility laws, the situation I was in with my mother, that sometimes elder people, particularly people without their own kids, wind up being financially responsible for their own parents, their own nursing home bills and so forth. My mother had enough money, so that wasn't a problem for us, so I was very lucky and privileged in that way. But some people didn't like the idea that I was talking about it because they were afraid that states might start enforcing it. And there was one case in Pennsylvania particularly that got some notoriety in 2012. I actually heard about that a little bit. So I did have the ability people thought I did have the ability to instigate things stochastically. That was a possibility, even without using algorithms, simply by being found by search engines, which was the innovation that happened in the late 90s. That you didn't even have to do anything you didn't even have to try to be found by search engines. You didn't really have to code anything. They would still find you. And as Google took over and everything, that was even before social media algorithms. That there was a stochastic effect that somebody like me could have. So it's, if you have intercourse and cause a pregnancy, you're responsible for the child. Well, if you can cause events even stochastically to happen out in society, should you have more accountability? And then philosophically, that sounds like a legitimate question. And so maybe you should have maybe if you have dependents, you have people depending on you, or maybe you should be, in my case, I would face being expected to join other people's causes and protests and so forth. And even though there might be a need for political alliances, and I might not agree with some of the ideas that I would be expected to support if I were part of a group. Some of the ideas, well, on the right, I certainly don't believe the election was stolen in 2020. Some friends of mine think it was. I'm certainly at odds with some of my conservative friends, but on the left, my friends in the gay community, I don't agree that a person has a right to claim that they are a gender other than their biological sex and expect other people to believe it when they're minors, unless they really go through a lot. I don't care what adults do, but I have a real problem with what's going on with minors and with the idea that it is sort of violation of essentially our sense of truth and our sense of the idea that you're supposed to accept somebody else's reality. It may be very real to them, but it's not really true. That bothers me, being expected to join that. So that's just how I feel about a lot of these things. So I'm going to post something soon on this legal blog about what the takedowns were. As I said, I think there's only about 4 sites left as I went through the 2022 and 2023 when a lot of stuff came down. I'm going to make an official posting about that pretty soon. But that's what I have for today, and thank you for listening.